Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Azure webinar on being effective in polarity and paradox. For the next 55 minutes or so, we're going to be exploring what polarity is, what that looks like in the context of today's world, and how we might need to adjust some of our own attitude and mindsets to be more effective in the complexity that we now see around us. Complexity that's always been with us, but which is becoming ever more present and evident as we progress in our understanding of life and organizational realities, and as we get new insights, and particularly the current crisis, I think, is bringing many things into sharper understanding, or at least visibility. So we'll explore some of that as we go through. Unlike other webinars, if you've attended others that we've been to, that we've offered, today we are intending to have some breakout space time and some opportunities for discussion. So please take advantage of those to deepen your questions or thinking or understanding about some of the material that we'll be sharing with you. And at the moment, we're going to keep the cameras off, but when we come into some plenary discussion or sharing, or indeed when you go into the breakout rooms, please feel free to put your cameras back on, and obviously that helps with some level of engagement. The other thing to say is that we are recording the session, and if you don't feel comfortable having your voice recorded or your picture recorded, that's fine. We're quite happy to cut out the interactive parts of this and just use the pieces where I'm inputting. So please don't feel that the fact that we're recording should hold you back. Okay, so let's get underway. And many of you on the session this morning will already know of Azure and know me, but I don't know everybody. My name's Lorraine Flower. And I'm part of Azure, which is a conscious leadership and organizational development consultancy. And by that, we mean we are helping organizations to come to a higher level of conscious awareness of how their organizations function, how their leadership is impacting both within the organization and in the broader communities and stakeholder groups within which we function. And of course, we're seeing an increased level of general and specific awareness to our impact on the planet, for example, at the moment. And whilst we are not CSR consultants or into the deep expression of all things environmental, we are nevertheless, from a purpose point of view, very much connected with the idea of creating a better world for all, and indeed the practice and reality of that. So that's what we mean by conscious leadership in a nutshell. More to say on that at some other time, but for now let's get on with having a look at polarity and what is the relevance of that for us in the current world in which we are living and current organizational space. This quote, which is actually from a spiritual source, but nevertheless has I think a useful content that helps us to get to grips a little bit more with this idea of both polarity but also duality, and we're going to be looking at both of those today. So everything is dual, in that what that means is that everything that we see in life has poles, has two ends of a spectrum, if you will. So it all has its pairs of opposites. But also, what is key to our understanding of polarity and paradox is recognizing that even those things that are like and unlike, so look similar but also different, are in fact the same. And this is quite a big concept to get our heads around, because we're much more used to separating and boxing and finding neat packaging for our ideas or our beliefs or our practices or ways of working. And yet, in its most fundamental level, when we look at the world, we will see that actually opposites are in fact identical in nature, but different in degree. And we'll explore more of that as we go through. So let me then share with you a broad agenda for our session today. We're going to break it into 4 core areas. One is looking at the human condition and thinking about what it is about the way we are that drives some of the polarity thinking, and how are we made up in that respect. We'll look at the shifts in mindset, awareness, and ultimately acceptance that we need to come into if we're going to navigate this area of polarity and paradox more effectively. We're going to look at a practical approach to that, which is looking at how you can engage people in this concept and practice, and a mapping tool that can help with that. And then look at this from a leadership point of view and harvesting the value of adopting a broader perspective when it comes to dealing with polarities. So this is the 4 areas that we're going to work with today. So the first area then, as I said, is the human condition. And we come into this world as babies, of course, and we're innocent and naive. And in fact, at that point, everything is as it needs to be within us. We are very much in a perfect state for all of a nanosecond. And then we start to engage in life. And we start to see that actually duality is fundamentally inherent in our nature. So we see male and female, we see positive and negative energies. What we attract and what we repel is alive within us. We see it in the way that the planet is set up and our interaction with life, the day and night. And these are fundamentally written into the laws of human life in every which way that we look. And as you start to open your eyes more broadly, we each of us can see these 2 poles, these dualities sitting in our life and in our world. However, within the human condition, there's also quite a strong impulse to create balance and harmony. So what we want to do is, even though we recognize that there are 2 extremes, we also are seeking to create a level of balance and harmony, but we don't find that easy to do. One of the ways that we do it, consciously and unconsciously, is by enabling, facilitating within us an interaction between the pairs of opposites, so between male and female, day and night, positive and negative. These are things that is built into our nature to be able to work out how to evolve our relationship with those 2. However, what's also in our nature is a tendency to get stuck and to become a bit polarized. And that comes because as we engage ourselves within the world, we find that certain strategies work. We find that having certain preferences, which we're born with, and characteristics that we're born with, that they work in a particular way. They help us to be successful. And so we build, from a neuroscience point of view, we build these neural pathways. They become very familiar, and we embed them as habits, as practices that we are able to do. And that includes our attitudes and our mindsets. So this polarization, which is different to recognizing the polarities, but that polarization means that we tend to get a bit stuck. And we need to use our will, our willpower, our willingness, that drive within us to actually move ourselves to a new place, so that we can actually move into that more harmonized and balanced relationship. So many of you will have seen this next image before. And as you engage with it, you may find initially that it's difficult to see what it is. And then you may find that you see an old lady. Some of you may see a young lady. Some of you may still be struggling to see either of those things. What is true is that for most of us, we can only see one at a time. We can either see the old lady or we can see the young lady. But as we develop, as we hone our skills in being able to recognize polarities and work with polarities, we actually are able to switch between the two much more quickly. So if you just stay with it for a second, having hopefully located the old lady and the young lady, as you blink and as you move your eyes, you will probably find that actually you are able to locate each of those more quickly, because you've started to create some awareness and you've started to create some acceptance that both exist. And now there's a faster pathway towards allowing them both to coexist. And we can train ourselves to do this in all other aspects of life too. So I've mentioned the duality and polarity. And these are two different concepts in many ways. Polarity is setting up the either-or situation. So either I am very planful or I'm very flexible. And it feels like those two cannot be held simultaneously. Either I'm very planful or I'm very flexible. These tend to be the ways that we go through life and identify ourselves. And many of the things, the psychometrics that we use and many of the analysis tools that we may use in personal development and leadership development and organizational development tend to look at, are you this or that? And increasingly, we need to be able to move more and more into the both and space, the duality space. And let me just give you an example. You'll all be familiar with the yin-yang symbol, which is really inviting us from an Eastern philosophy point of view to recognize that both and. And we can look at that in a specific example where if we think about this in terms of politics, for example, when we look at duality, we can start to see that within the field of people who are conservatives, there are also those who are moderate conservatives. In other words, they are able to get close and closer to the thinking, the philosophy, the principles, the values of the liberal politics. So they already bring some of that into their worldview, into their way of connecting. And similarly with the liberals, there as a subset, there are those who are called moderate liberals who are able to approach some of the conservative principles and values. And actually within politics itself as a system, and certainly in the US this is true, but pretty much every president that has ever been elected has been because of the ability to move those people who are in the moderate categories and influence them to identify more closely with their essential polarity. So a conservative being able to attract across moderate liberals because there's enough switching, enough resonance between those two. This is duality, the ability to hold both poles at the same time, or at least have some approximation of that, not in an absolute sense. So one more input just before we then break into some sharing and some discussion. And that is thinking about polarities and dualities as a pathway to growth. And again, this is part of the human condition. We know we are wired to develop, to grow, to evolve. This is part of our inherent nature. And if we think about the idea of polarities, so one end of a spectrum and another end of a spectrum, if, like a moderate liberal or a moderate conservative, we can start to hold both of those poles and move towards more of a duality place, what happens is we actually expand. So as though we start to move to a point of synthesis, we actually grow our capability to hold more possibility and potential. But equally what happens is that just as we move to some level of synthesis, quite often a new polarity will open up for us. And we will find ourselves in a new place of tension between 2 points, and then have to do more refining as we move to a new point of synthesis. And so these are not absolutes. It's not all or nothing. We find ourselves on a journey of growth that bit by bit enables us to move towards a higher container, a space, a bigger space, where we can actually absorb and work with many different aspects of these two polarities. So I'm going to invite you to just reflect on your own relationship with what we might euphemistically call black and white thinking or polarized thinking, and where those polarities perhaps show up for you. And so a personal example from me is that I mentioned planning and flexibility earlier. I certainly have a very, very strong bias towards planfulness and being organized and so on and so forth. And yet I have found in my life increasing provocation to flexibility, to understanding that and to working with it and to integrating it more and more, which doesn't mean I deny my planfulness, but it does mean that I am increasingly able to expand my capability for flexibility. Do I have an inherent preference for planfulness? Yes. Can I absorb and live comfortably with flexibility? Increasingly, yes, as well. So as we evolve, we get a new relationship with those poles. So what are your polarities? What is your point of tension between this and that, either or thinking? So welcome back, everybody, and I hope you had an opportunity to just start to connect a little bit with your own relationship with polarity and the degree to which maybe you get yourself caught within one aspect of a spectrum of thinking versus another, and maybe even starting now to think about those examples where you've already approached some point of synthesis, something where you were starting to absorb both ends of the spectrum, at least to some degree. We'll explore that a little bit more in the mapping section as well. So just then moving us on into the mindset, awareness and acceptance aspect of our agenda, and we're going to look at what do we actually need to start to be paying attention to that will enable us to be more effective in the area of polarity management and dealing with paradox. The first thing perhaps to think about is the fundamental nature of polarity again, but also this idea that the two ends of a spectrum, of a continuum, actually need each other to exist. And breathing is quite an interesting example of this. And this is a slide that an image that I've borrowed from Sapix, who have done some thinking in this area as well. But just to think about breathing as a practice. And there is this kind of cycle, this eternity cycle, where as we inhale and exhale, we are working with the principle of needing to get in oxygen and enough oxygen without there being too much carbon dioxide in our body. In other words, therefore, we have to exhale to clean out the carbon dioxide. But at that point, then we risk having too little oxygen, which means we have to inhale again. So at that and point, that both and, we can't just do one or the other. Both are needed for our long-term success. And this is a kind of fairly fundamental mindset piece for approaching polarity. Because if we don't recognize the value of both ends of a spectrum, of a continuum, then we will struggle to move into that place of the both and. And if we think about our context and our world, this is a slide, an image that we use a lot here at Azure, which is really recognizing the nature of our workplace, of our world, that is becoming more and more visible, I think, to us. Historically, we have tended to want to move to the bottom left-hand corner of this diagram, which is where we are looking for high levels of certainty, high levels of agreement, conclusion about how things might be tackled within an organizational space. And that takes us down to the road of wanting to make things simple, to be able to resolve problems, sort opportunities, do that quickly, because we can see that there is a right answer. We can make some decisions based on fact. We see a clear cause and effect relationship. And that's typically in organizational life, from the point of view of efficiency, we like to move as much as possible down into that bottom left-hand corner. Our reality, however, is that we are living much more in a complex space. And in that complexity, we are increasingly seeing that there's much more mess and muddle. You've only got to take our current situation with COVID, that the daily, almost hourly briefings that have been needed across nations as more information becomes available, as a new direction seems to be a better one, another step in this direction seems to be needed, where it's so huge that getting a right answer is a folly. It's a fool's errand to try and think there's anything absolute that can be managed. So this space of complexity requires us to be in relationship with two ends of a spectrum, the two ends of the continuum. It requires us to be able to probe, to sense, to be in a space where we do experiment and test out. And it is in this space that paradox and polarity really start to come onto our radar. So if we think about then the difference between that simple space and the idea of polarities in that complex space, really what we're talking about is that polarities are generally things that are quite chronic, they're issues that are unavoidable, and they're not immediately solvable. So they tend not to be able to be reconcilable. They are interdependent, as we saw with the breathing example, so they need both, and organizations need both. For example, a task focus and a people focus, or creativity versus risk management, i.e. control and limitation. These are needed, they are needed, but they have to be able to coexist at a higher level of interdependence than we typically see in organizations. And just to kind of differentiate between a problem and a polarity, a problem tends to have one or two or maybe more right answers that are in themselves independent. So you can use either or thinking in that situation. An example of that might be, should we buy this particular piece of machinery? Well, there will be pros and cons, either ors. There'll be things that we can think about. We can move ourselves to a point of decision making. Should we remove one level of management? Well, there's these arguments for and these arguments against. We can have a look at the analysis and we can come to a solution. Should we promote somebody? Again, these are problems that have one or two or more right answers, and we can navigate our way through those, but largely because we will have past experience to draw on. But polarities generally have multiple right answers that are interdependent and require us to use and thinking. Examples like recognize the individual and recognize the team, reduce cost and improve quality, work commitments and home commitments, and we're seeing some development in that area currently as well. So to manage polarity, or to get into polarity management, we have to be able to see that it can have an impact on our system. And typically where we see the best impact is where there is a lot of complexity and we're able to see both the forest and the trees, be able to see the big picture and the detail of that complex situation, where there is a lot of change going on, and we look to convert any resistance to change into seeking both stability and change, so that both and situation again. In conflict, where there are conflicting ideas and points of view and values even, we move into that both and thinking, which ultimately moves towards the success for all idea. And also where we are seeing the need for and the value of a lot of diversity, and where we can increase our understanding and practice of respecting, utilising and celebrating difference. If we think about some of these polarities and how they look, what are they, how might we see them? Well, at a high level, we might see things like the degree to which we need to be apart or connected. Well, I think what we're seeing in today's world is that both are present and both are true. We are both apart, isolated, and yet many people reporting a higher level of connection than they have maybe experienced in other ways. So both and. In organizations, we've seen situations where there's been a move towards just-in-time practices, the lean practices, and in the procurement and supply chain cycle, really making sure that from an efficiency and from a cost effectiveness point of view, we just get those materials in when we need them, the supplies in when we need them. What we find in today's world is with too much emphasis on that, we don't have the reserves, we don't have enough slack in the system, and we can't respond as quickly as we need to. We need to find the right harmonious balance between both and. So these are a range of examples, but if we look at them also very specifically in the organizational space, we can see things like the degree to which we want to lead in a more directive way and the degree to which we want to empower, the balance between relationships and tasks, or people and tasks. Structure and flexibility may be something that we see playing out in the way, even in the way that we design our organizations, but also through to the way in which we govern and manage within our organizations. To what degree do we like to have good structures and processes, and do they serve as well? But when do we need flexibility? Similarly with support and challenge. In the Collins and Porras book, Built to Last, they found that those organizations that were capable of managing paradox were those that were the most visionary companies and the most successful companies. And their ability to embrace both extremes was something that really added to their bottom line performance. So it's not just a concept, it's also about a bottom line. We're talking about shifts in mindset, and that's really what you brought up as well, Catherine. And we've got to be able to get people from this idea that consistency is the be all and end all, and that we can move into consistent inconsistency, both and. So where we are able to avoid the temptation to just go with operational and let go of the transformational in the example you gave us, Catherine, and move to a place where both have the coexistent reality. They live in a coexistent, interdependent way. But to do that, we also have to shift our mindset from this idea of scarce resource to abundant. And by that, what we mean is we've got to be able to think between the normal, beyond the normal constraints, and find new ways of creating value in an organization. And that comes from a broader focus and a broader perspective. That's how we start to embrace something more abundant and more and richer in that sense, rather than a reductionist approach, which is where the scarce mindset comes from. And being able to move from stability and certainty, that sort of fixedness, to dynamism and change. And that's about being willing to lean into more ambiguity and work out where and when stability has a value for us. And these are some fairly fundamental mind shift changes that are needed in this embracing of paradox and polarity. So let's move into the mapping, because I think many of you may have looked at this tool before, but it's just useful to see that you can bring what feels like at times quite an abstract concept, this idea of polarity management, of working with paradox, being in that more complex space. But you can ground it, you can bring it into something quite practical and grounded as a methodology, as a way of helping people to think about it. There's a kind of broad 6-step process for managing this. you can do it in this linear form. In reality, it will be much more circular, and I'll show you that in a second. But it is about identifying where is the area of greatest polarity, where are we seeing the most pain because we're taking that either or approach, and then looking at how you start to map that using a mapping tool. And this particular tool is the one that looks very complex on the screen, but is actually quite a straightforward process for thinking about the both and scenario. So in this worked example, we've got tasks and relationships. And what we're basically doing with the mapping process is starting to look at all of the things that are positive, all the positive values that sit within task focus, and all of the positive values that sit within a relationship focus. And we allow those to coexist. We also look at those things that would be perhaps negative results from over focusing on those, too much task or too much relationship. So if we're over task focused, we won't be paying attention to each other. We may go and work on our own and we don't get so much support from others, and we may be seeing some of this going on in this virtual environment. Are people getting enough of that relationship support, pastoral support? On the relationship side, on the positive, we see that people help each other to get the job done well, but also they may overdo that and get into not doing their own work as well. And what we can then start to do is look at how we might recognize that in the system. How could we recognize those negatives? And how do we start to see those positives in play? And we can start to, if you remember the diagram of the two poles and then moving to the yin yang symbol, we can start to identify what are the steps that might allow us to have both living in an interdependent, coexistent way, which is the action steps that you see on either side of this map. So working with the polarity management matrix is a very almost left brain way of bringing something that is quite challenging to give form to and tangibility to, but to actually start to turn it into something quite planful and quite practical. And when we're doing this, of course, we have to engage the whole organization. We have to think about the fact that this apparent ambiguity, this complexity can lead to a number of consequences. So for example, if you're trying to hold a both and scenario, it could end up with you seemingly as a leadership team looking a bit flaky. Well, can you not decide which way we want to go? Are we this or are we that? When you're telling me we're both. That's a risk, that's a challenge, and that's something we as leaders have to overcome by more openness, more transparency, more willingness to build into our communication, our narrative, our language, the valuing of both ends of a continuum of the polarity, and indeed then pointing out the harmony that comes from bringing two ends of those spectrums together in very practical ways. So naming those tensions and the polarities, building dialogue and discussion about how those are brought to a first level of harmonious resolution alongside each other, recognizing the need for growth and that this is both a personal and collective growth process, and also the courage to experiment. These are the qualities and some of the practices that are needed if we are going to engage the organization in the principles of polarity management and ultimately navigating through paradox. And one of the questions that is perhaps worth just reflecting on at this point is, when you think about trying to bring something in that has got this slightly more abstract feel to it, perhaps for some people, particularly in organizations that are more used to working in very tangible task, perhaps operational environments, then we could see a number of challenges that could come about as we start to think about bringing more of this practice into awareness and consciousness. So of course, as soon as we step into this space, we're actually challenging some fairly fundamental values of what a business is about, what its purpose is, what its vision is, how it sees itself, the values that it's operating to. And that brings us into the challenge of leaders. And I'm just going to move us into that, conscious that we've just got a few minutes left. Thank you for teeing this up, Margaret, because really what we're talking about here is for this to start to shift, leaders, by that I'm meaning those in particular positions of influence, most likely going to be at the top of an organization, but not only, anybody who has significant influence, needs to be thinking about 4 different aspects of the organization when they're looking to take this sort of thinking and approach forward. The other thing I'd say, just before I go on to those 4, is that I think we're being taken in this direction in many respects anyway. So one of the arguments I would make if I was putting a business case together would be to try and help leaders to see that actually this is a reality, that complexity, that need for flexibility, that need for agility, that need for making small steps and then revisiting and making more adjustments. This is part of the life that we are seeing, and complexity is part of our everyday experience. And therefore, if we don't start to adopt some of these practices, that we may well be left behind. But let's look at those 4 areas for leaders to think about in harvesting something in this area. Firstly, the paradoxes that come to do with the performance of the organization. And here we hit right at the core of what do we believe a business is about, what do we believe an organization is there to do. And we could look at this through the CSR lens, for example. For some organizations, their performing kind of criteria will be, yes, we'll embrace CSR because it's financially good business. That could be the kind of resolution of that paradox. For others, CSR may be adopted because it's about moral values and social good. In other words, by getting into the fundamentals of what an organization is about, you start to rule in what's in and what's out, and that starts to give you your territory. Now, every organization has this. Sometimes it's more it's made more clear, and sometimes it's more ambiguous and less transparent in the sense that it shifts about. So the first is, what type of organization are we? What's in and out? This, in terms of our fundamental beliefs and structures. What are we willing to do and what are we not willing to do? What are we trying to do and what are we not trying to do? Then there's the, how do we organize ourselves? How are we going to operate? And thinking about that in terms of a series of polarities as well. Are we centralized and decentralized? Do we want to empower or direct? Are we looking to collaborate with people, or are we looking to have more competition? These ways in which we behave and organize ourselves starts to then look at the sort of more cultural aspects of the organization, and leaders need to be giving that conscious, serious thought. The third area is coming into thinking about the nature of belonging. How do we want to organize ourselves in order to optimize the right levels of belonging? And here we're thinking about the degree to which that's individual or collective mindsets, or matrix or linear structures. How do we want people to experience their level of value and worth as a member of this organization? And many obviously are looking to blend those, and that in itself brings its own complexities and polarities. And then there's something about, how do we grow? What can we cope with in the learning process, and how do we allow ourselves to learn and grow? And that's things like the balance between are we focused on today, or are we looking at tomorrow? Are we an organisation that looks backwards, or are we an organisation that looks forwards? Are we open to new ideas, or do we only work with the tried and tested? These are also parameters that start to define the space in which we can move and grow as an organisation, but they are questions and challenges for leaders. I said that we needed to come back to this idea of duality, and again this bringing together of the two poles. And Although I described a sort of linear process very briefly for getting into the mapping exercise, in reality, what we need to do is start to see this as a much more circular process. It has much more movement to it. And to do that, we need to be obviously able to recognize the poles. In this example, organizations that value individualism and or community. So in our organization, we want individualism, we want people to feel strong as individuals, but we also want there to be a sense of community. If we overemphasize the need for individualism, it will delay the opportunity for community to be built, and also with the other pole. If, however, we start to look at this as much more of a system, then we start to look at the movements that are needed within that. So again, it comes back to the map, but this time drawn in a more organic way, that says, what are the different, if we do this, then that delivers that and upweights. So this one is particularly looking at what happens when we value all of those things that are to do with individualism, and how does that then start to move within the system? How do we use it? We then would do the same for community, and we would start to see the interplay between them. So in other words, we have to look in a much more holistic and organic way. So if we look at that in very practical terms, or maybe more practical terms, if we then take that idea of individual and community, we can start to see that rather than having one dominate the other, the circularity of movement starts to move us into this space where we have a strong sense of community that actually in itself provides opportunities for individuals to express their personality within a reasonable boundary. And in a high functioning family, for example, this is what we see. I can be me, and I can be together. I can be safe and secure in my community, and I value the community called family, but also I don't have to deny who I am as an individual. Similarly, if we take change and stability, rather than having something where everything is moving all of the time, to come back to Margaret's example, equally, we don't want something that is stagnating and risks us becoming a dinosaur. What we want to be able to do is set some clear purposes and principles that allow people to then explore and bring in new approaches. So we do have to do but a certain amount of parameter down, and then we open up the freedom to move. So just in drawing this to a close, I wanted to bring us back to this diagram that I shared with you right at the beginning, which is this idea of polarity management being a pathway to growth. It's a learning process, and it's about including more within our growthfulness in a very conscious and visible and transparent way, and being prepared to go in and really name those two ends of a continuum and explore the degree to which they are affecting the success of an organization, and to bring ourselves to a place where ultimately, as we make each step up that evolutionary growth path, we come to a place where we live with this idea of the breathing example, the both and. We find our point, our sweet point, which won't be the same for every organization, but nevertheless allows us to bring together the best of what is right for our organization. Now have a great day, and go exploring those polarities and see what you can bring into the organization from a new perspective. Thanks everybody, and thanks for joining us.